Hello, and welcome to a new video, Archers, and how to make them worth using. My name is Pandan, and we're going to be talking about Archers today to the soundtrack of Chrono Trigger. This is Quarters of Time. I was listening to this a bit earlier, and I'm like, this track just freaking grooves. It's going to be some chill background music while we talk about Archers. So, the reason I'm making this video is because play a lot of romhacks, play a lot of Fire Emblem in general, have some opinions, specifically around Archers, because I see this question come up a lot, and I see people try to fix Archers differently. People ask, well, how do I make Archers worth using? In GBA especially, Archers are pretty bad. I don't think anyone's out here to arguing that Archers and GBA are worth anything. Archers across Fire Emblem generally struggle to be really relevant. And so people are wondering, well, how do I fix Archers? And there are some solutions I've seen that aren't so great, and others I've seen that work really well at giving them niche and the power to be worth using. So we're going to talk a little bit more today about how we do that, and also some of the missteps that I've seen that some projects take, and that even the vanilla games take, which is to the detriment of these Archers. And so I have Leon and Python here, just because I like their art. We're not really going to be talking too much about them. Gaiden Archers are kind of like a weird beast. Gaiden's just like a weird beast in general to talk about, because like you kind of get to use everyone all the time. And so really all you're doing is just like not using a free unit for the most part. But I digress. Anyway, what are we going to talk about today? Let's keep moving. Learning objectives. We're going to, or you, as the viewer, you will understand what factors cause an archer to perform either well or poorly in the context of their game. So, this is a really important piece to note here, is that you can't look at a character, their class, their weapons in a vacuum. You have to look at it relative to the game that they're in, the series of chapters, the series of puzzles and challenges that they're up against. And so we'll talk more about that. You'll understand kind of like what makes the Archer good and what makes the Archer bad. If you're watching this, you probably already know. 2. How to design Archers so that they are useful and worth using despite their flaws. This is really important. Archers are by their nature a flawed class, so we'll talk more about how to make them worthwhile despite that. And my favorite, what to avoid when designing Archers and bows in your game. There are things that you might do that you think are helping, but they really don't, or maybe they tip the scale a little too far in the direction, and then they become a little overpowered. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and get started. So before we go into all this, I think it's important to level set and just talk a bit more about Archers through the ages. We have our board Gordon here. Let's just look at vanilla, because one of the things I did when prepping for this video is I looked at almost all the vanilla Archers. And I wanted to see, like, were there any trends across Archers that were considered bad and Archers that were considered good? Like, what were the things that they had in common in spite of the differences throughout their games? And so you'll see that there are some things in common here. We're going to start with some bad Archers. Here's Ronan from Thracia. Everyone loves Ronan. He's fun to use. He's got adept. He's got movement stars. He's just like a gambler. He's like just gambling man. He's RNG boy. But let's look at Ronan. So, like a lot of Archers that you get in the early game, especially a Fire Emblem, comes in early. He has he gets a couple maps where he's free, which is great. But look at the stats, man. Like, even though Thracia has the 20 caps, which he can certainly hit with enough love and support, like any of these units we're about to talk about, but his bases are really bad. Remember, Archers, they're player phase units. They're going to be doing almost all of their combat on player phase. If they're lucky, they're going to be attacking maybe more than one enemy per turn, but usually just around one. And he's got 4 strength and an iron bow that has like 5 might. He's doing a solid 9 damage out of the gate. And you've got to deal with that until he gets level 2, where he might get a level up in strength, but I don't know how that's going to happen. You can see Ronan, he's got low FCC. He's not a great looking unit. He's super fun, but not a good unit. Similarly, we got our boy Wolt from Fire Emblem 6, the Binding Blade. And Bolt, similarly, he joins Chapter 1. And look at his bases, man. Like, this is GBA. You know, caps are in, like, the mid-20s, roughly high 20s, depending upon, like, I think it's like a high, like, almost like a 30 skill cap for an archer, high speed cap. And just look at these bases, man. Like, even with, like, decent growth rates, which he does have, like, you're starting out from such a disadvantage. Like, you're also hitting, again, for, like, 9 or 10 damage with that Iron Bow out of the gate. Like, if you played hard mode, like, Wolt's hitting like a noodle by, like, Chapter 4. He's getting, like, nothing done. Just has nothing really redeeming about him as a character. And the fact that he can't enemy phase also doesn't really help his case. Like, Wolt is just, like, not a very good unit. Then we got Nami. Oop, where was that? Nami from Fire Emblem 8. Very similar. Look, she's got a little bit better stats than Wolt. Joins a couple chapters later, but she's still got that measly 4 strength, the Iron Bow. Not a great bow rank. She has good affinity and a fast support with Colm, which helps her out, and she also benefits from being able to promote to a ranger to get swords and a mount, so she's salvageable that way. But it's a lot of work, man. You gotta baby this unit super hard, and all these units gotta baby really hard. They're useful for the minimal chip they do, and like the couple chapters they're free, but otherwise, like, not really too much to write home about here. And I can go on and talk about like Dorothy and Will and Rebecca, Thomas from FE1, but like, you kind of get the drift here with what I'm saying. These units, what they have in common is they have crappy bases, don't have access to great weapons, and so they don't give the player a great impression, which we'll talk more about. But on the flip side, let's talk about some of the things that are like good units, or at least units that are considered, like, across archers, considered good. We have our homeboy George. FE3 Book 2 is my personal favorite rendition of this character. And FE3, if you haven't played it, it's also a Akkad game with 20 cap stats. So he's already, you know, on his way to being able to get close to capping most things without much help, which is fine as a pre-promote joining in Chapter 8. For his join time, his stats are pretty solid. And what's really most important to call out is this thing here, the Parthia. This is a really good bow. I would argue that getting Parthia in Chapter 8 is one of the reasons why people will tell you that, like, Gordon and Ryan are good units to use in FE3 Book 2. Kashtor, Kashim, even actually Warren's still pretty crap, as much as I like the guy. But the Parthia comes with it. It's dope. It does a lot of damage. He does his job pretty well for a pre-promote sniper. We got Jamka from Fire Emblem 4. Stat line, you know, FE4, he has good combat. His stats are solid for when he joins pretty early on in Chapter 1. He comes with a killer bow, which really helps him out in combat with all those skills. He does a lot of damage, really good at 1v1, does nicely in the arena. I mean, I think you'd argue, like, well, Dan, he's not really that good. He doesn't have a mount in his FE4. Like, he's not that good. Yeah, I'm looking at his combat. We could argue back and forth about who's better between him and Midir. I personally think Midir is a better unit, but Jamka still holds his own. He's still useful. You can use him whenever, and he does nice damage. So, something else to consider, right? He comes early. He's got a good weapon. And then Klein, FE6. See, these are his base stats when he joins in Chapter 11, which are pretty solid for the time he joins. Like, he'll generally outclass many of the other units you've been using up to this point, just from, like, pure, like, stat values alone. But he also comes with a silver bow, and he's going to probably have the highest bow rank of any of your other units. So he's going to be really the only one able to use this. And I was actually looking at Dorothy's stats. I think I was talking to Warpath about this. She has like a 50% strength growth and joins at level 5. Even if she had her average strength and then 10 levels, or 15 levels proctored like, what, 7-8 times and promoted, she would still have less strength than Klein, who comes for free. And you could have given all that experience to someone else. So Klein is really strong, really solid pre-promoted archer unit. But you can see some of the trends here, right? Like, these units that are generally considered to be like pretty usable for archers, they have solid bases and access to solid weapons almost immediately. And that's going to dive into some of the other things we're going to talk about in just a bit. But I also want to make mention real quick of probably the best archer that Intelligent Systems has ever made, Takumi. Fire Emblem Fates, Fire Emblem 14. Joins Chapter 10 of Birthright, which is by no means a hard game, even on the harder difficulties. But Takumi has pretty solid stats for his join time, and really importantly, he has the Fujin Yumi, just unbreakable, really strong weapon, immediately stands out from many other folks in the cast. And when he's that powerful, when he's that good, it's hard to argue, like, why would I not deploy this guy? Because he just deletes stuff. And so you're willing to take his lack of an enemy phase because he has access to such a good weapon and can do so much damage with it. So some things here. I'm sure you're starting to pick up on what I'm putting down, and we can go on and we can talk more about other archers that are considered pretty good, but I think you get the point here. So now that we've looked at that and kind of level set with vanilla, and you kind of gauge like where my barometer is, let's talk about archer design. How do they earn their deployment slot? This is really important because Fire Emblem, at least traditionally, is about choosing between which units to use in specific situations. Most of the time, you're going to have an army, probably by the end of the game, of like 30 to 40 units. You're probably going to be able to deploy between like 10 to 14 of them. And you have to pick, should I choose Unit A or Unit B? Should I choose the Archer? Should I choose the Cavalier? Should I choose the Armor Knight? You're probably not choosing the Armor Knight, let's be real. Unless you're me. But when it comes to earning the deployment slot, you have to think about how the archers are designed. So let's talk about what we can do to help archers earn that deployment slot. It's one thing when they're free, like in their join chapters, or if it's really early game before you have preps or other units that could push them to the bench, like Wolt, for example. Like, yeah, of course you're going to use Wolt the first like 3 chapters because he's free and it is chip, but you're sure as hell going to bench him immediately after. So how do we prevent that from happening? So some things to consider. First thing, join time. Not a lot of people talk about join time, but I think it's really important to make mention of here, especially with archers. And join time is important, so let's talk about some of these things like early game. And the early game is generally when playing field between units is even. And what I mean by this is that the units that the player have, like none of them have been able to snowball yet. Everyone also has like an equal opportunity to shine because you're resource deprived in most games early. You don't have that many units. No one's really that strong yet besides like the units that were designed to be like really strong at that point in the game. But even they can't do everything. You kind of need to rely on these other units that you have to get things done. And so by that nature, if you do put an archer in the early game, you're probably going to at least try to use them. And so when you have an archer join early game, you really want to consider, well, how do I make sure that this person gives off a good impression? We'll talk a little bit more about that. Similarly, mid-late game units, they should have solid enough bases to contribute immediately. No one's ever saying, man, I wish the next S unit that Intelligent Systems makes, I wish it was an archer. Like, no one's saying that. Mid-late game units, they need to be able to contribute pretty immediately. Like, look at Klein. He comes in, he's got solid stats, he's got a good weapon, he comes in, he does some damage, he does his job. And this is really important because you want to make sure, lastly, they show up the strengths of the player immediately. Like, archers' flaws are really obvious. They have no enemy phase. That's really the biggest one. They have no enemy phase. They can only attack once per turn without a dance or support, right? If they're only doing this one thing, they need to be able to do that well. And so you, as a designer, need to figure out, well, how do I make sure that the archer is able to show off their strengths to the player so that they build a positive impression? Like, if you think about units that you've used in the past, how often do you use a unit that gives off a poor impression in their join map where you're like, this guy's probably not going to be that good, so I'm just going to bench him? But if someone has like a really good opening chapter, their join map, they tear up, you're like, okay, I'm going to invest in this guy. He did really well here. So keep that in mind. So with archers, you want to make sure you're showing off their strengths to the player immediately. One of the strengths that I think we need to talk about are weapons. Let's talk about bows. So what are some things you can do to make bows useful? And we're going to talk, and you're going to find as we go through this, a lot of this is going to kind of bleed in to each other. This is the nature of this discussion. It's all very closely tied together. So I'm trying to break it apart as much as possible to kind of give that very like refined view into what I'm thinking about. But with weapons specifically, you also have to consider relative to other weapons. So consider that caveat as well. The first thing for weapons, for bows, high might, right? Like, if you look across the series, a lot of bows don't really have that great of might relative to their peers. In fact, like, they're often weaker than axes and lances in many cases. And so what does that tell you, right? Like, I have these other weapons that are more versatile, that are doing more damage. Why am I using the specialized weapon that doesn't even do that as well? The other benefit of high might is that it has the multiplier with effective damage. So, like, if you have an iron bow with 6 might versus an iron bow with 9 might, it's going to be like an extra 9 damage on that high might bow when fighting something that's super effective against. And that's going to be a big difference. It's a lot of extra damage. You want to make sure that shines through. So high might is really important on bows because they rely on that effective damage in those niche situations where they're meant to be useful against flyers. Conversely, you can also make other weapons weaker. GBA is the worst offender of this, in my opinion, because it's so enemy phase oriented that archers don't really have much of a niche there because there's so many more effective ways to get rid of things on the enemy phase. But also you have 1-2 range weapons that are really good, like the hand axe and the javelin. Slap one of those on Marcus, Seth, Jarrah, name your Jagan, name your Cav, right? They're going to just clean house and take care of both the close and the far range. So I think Thracia does a really nice job of making these 1-2 range weapons weaker. They're heavier, they don't do as much damage, they're less accurate, they're not reliable. And this really allows bows to have greater strength because you see them as the superior 2-range option for physical weapons. Like, if I want to attack something from far away and not take damage, I'm not going to grab the hand axe as my first choice. I'm going to go for the bow. And you want players to think that way as well. And part of this is by making those 1-2 range options less sexy. Now, magic, on the other hand, like, magic is a whole different ballgame because it's attacking res. Yeah, it has 1-2 range. Mages in general, like, aren't designed to be like great frontlining, at least if you're thinking through like design from a vanilla standpoint. So keep that in mind. Like, magic's going to be a bit of a different beast, but when it comes to like long range physical weapons, your bow is going to be the way to go. It's got it's effective on flyers, and it's going to have guaranteed the best 2 range, right? Like, that's a pretty good niche. The other thing that I see a lot of people do or don't do is focus on differentiation. So when you're thinking in the context of vanilla, right? So getting back to this like hand axe example, you might look at the hand axe and be like, wow, like, this hand axe makes whoever uses it really useful because they can attack close and far away. What if I gave archers the same thing? What if I gave them a 1-2 range weapon? Why don't we call it the short bow? And now you've triggered me and everyone. And it's funny because, like, I see this happen over and over again, but everyone kind of collectively groans when they see it. But what are you trying to do? You're trying to cover the weakness, right? The way that decision is being made is you're looking at, all right, well, this archer, their main weapon, their iron weapon is 2 range only. What if we gave them a 1-2 range weapon so they could compete with the javelins and the hand axes, etc.? The problem with this is that it makes archers less unique and more like other units. And the way archers are typically statted, which we'll cover more in just a bit, is they're generally not real. I mean, you saw some of the stats in those archers. Like, compare those stats to like Lot or Dorcas or a Cavalier with a javelin, right? Like, those stats, their base stats are generally better. So they're better at like being up front to begin with. Well, the archers, like a good archer at least, is going to be like more focused on their offense, their speed and their strength, probably have lower defense. You don't really want them at 1 range as much. So even then you might think, okay, I can go into melee with this bow user, but actually Volt isn't going to really do too much damage here. Volt's going to take a big hit, and that's not good. I'd rather just like throw like Wade in front, because Wade can tank a little bit better. I'll give him the hand axe. So you're not really solving the problem with by making bows more like other weapons. You need to focus on differentiation. What can bows do that my other weapons can't? What problems can bows solve for me that I can't solve without them, or at least can't solve as well without them? An example of this is 2-3 range. I've seen a couple places do this. I think Radiant Dawn, with its masterclass having access to 3 range just with standard bows, is a pretty cool way to give them like a unique niche. Souls of the Forest does this as well. I'd argue it's a little bit too powerful in Souls of the Forest in general, but I think that's more just like a function of units. But regardless, it's different, right? Bows can do something that no other weapon can. That could be 2-3 range. It could be giving access to a unique type of effectiveness that other weapons don't have. There are ways that you can make bows different. I think FE7X has it so that bows, when they're attacking, have weapon triangle advantage against Reaver weapons, which is pretty unique. And they're at disadvantage against Reaver weapons up close. So that's like a pretty unique thing, different spin on it. But it makes them different, right? Like, you have to find ways to be different. One of the things I like about 2-3 range is that allows them to safely attack mages, which is something that no other class can do. And that's a pretty unique niche in and of itself. So focus on what makes the bows different. Focus on things that will make the player say, all right, I have the situation. I think only the bow can solve this. I must study the bow to solve this problem. So focus on differentiation with your weapons versus trying to make bows more like other weapons that are already pretty good. So that's that on differentiation. And then early access to a strong weapon. Impressions are really important. Like, I thought Wrath in FE7 was so freaking cool after that cutscene in Limbo. He comes in, crits that guy, you see the CG with the dead body, and you're like, whoa, who is this dude? Gotta use him. And, you know, he's not really that great, but he's still fun. And as that first impression, though, right, versus Wolf, you have him, and it's like, wow, this guy's like barely doing like a third of the damage against this brigand in the beginning. Can't wait to bench this guy. Early access to a strong weapon is a good way to help give the player a positive impression without like pumping the unit full of steroids and giving them really buff stats, which can cause other issues downstream. So a strong weapon is a good way to give the unit immediate viability, to get the player interested in using them and considering like, wow, like Klein has a silver bow, he's doing crazy damage with it, I'm going to try and invest in this unit, I'm going to try and use it more. Right? It's a different thing. Wow, Takumi has the Fujin Yumi right off the bat. He's doing a lot of damage with it. I wonder what else he can do. Right? Like, it's a different shift in mindset that gets made by the impression. And so a strong weapon up front can be good. Like, maybe consider in your project having like the first steel weapon that appears to be a steel bow. Or maybe giving the player, one of the things I do in Vision Quest is I give the longbow in like chapter 2. Which is just like, wow, like that's going to give him a unique niche right off the bat. It gives the player a strong impression of the character using that weapon. So it can help definitely make bow users stand out if they have access to a strong weapon right up front. But I'll digress. We'll move on. Unit stats. So I've touched upon this a little bit, but you have to consider the stats of the archers as well. You saw those stats before, those archers that were bad. They weren't very good. Archers have pretty low bases. I think some of the worst bases, especially in GBA. Like their class bases are pretty crap. But how do you want to make archers statted? Like, how do I think about the archer stats if I'm doing some tweaks and rebalancing to the vanilla formula? They need to be top heavy. And by top heavy, I mean strength, skill, speed. Those are the stats archers are going to care about. Those are the stats they're going to be using on the regular. And so archers should focus on these areas. Their caps certainly suggest those are stats that they're good at. I don't think in vanilla that really gets delivered on very often. So keep that in mind. They should have good offenses. Archers don't need defense. They're not going to be doing too much phase tanking unless you're, desperate or making mistakes. They need to be strong enough on offense to justify the lack of an enemy phase. You have to make the player think this guy's offense is so good that I don't care that he can't take a hit. Think about mages the same way. Like, you look at, I think, to be topical or relevant examples like Lysithea, who doesn't really take damage very well at all, but she will sure as hell one-hit KO them. A lot of mages are like that, or shaman or monks or whatever. are so strong offensively, they can't take hits very well, but they're so good at offense that you don't care. It's glass cannon mindset. They need to be glass cannons. And they need to be, in this last piece, I'll caveat this, fast enough to double more than most of your units. And what I mean by this, and I'm kind of baking in my own philosophy here, is that I believe that Fire Emblem, when like all of your units one round, it's really boring because it doesn't really matter who's doing it. Like, do I want to one round with the Iron Axe, the Hand Axe, with this unit, with that unit? It's like every unit does the same thing. And I believe that to make Fire Emblem more interesting and to make differentiation between units matter more, you need to make it so that you can't one round all the time. One rounding should be the exception, not the norm, even later in the game. That's my view. And in the context of how I would think about balancing archers, I want them to be fast enough to double more than most of my units. I think doubling should also not necessarily be the rule when you're designing games because it leads to a lot of one rounding. But archers should be on the faster end of things. Part of their differentiation should be they can more reliably double than some of the other units that you have, which gives them literally double the firepower. So that one's baking in a little bit of my philosophy on it. In vanilla, like, this never really matters, right? Like, everyone doubles. It's like not doubling, it's like, wow, you must be really bad. So I'm going to lean on the units that can do the most things. Like, Cavaliers are so dominant in GBA because the enemies aren't strong enough to justify the niche uses of any of the other classes. Like, I can just throw my Cavs in every situation and not really get punished for it because the enemies are so weak. So like, it comes down to like who has the best movement, who has access to the 1-2 range weapons that I like. Those are going to be the classes that excel in those environments when enemies are bad. When enemies are strong, and when you can't double everything or can't one-run everything, then you have to think a little bit more strategically about the type of unit that you use. And that's kind of how you make bows useful and archers useful, is that, okay, I don't necessarily think that my one Cavalier can handle everything, or my squad of Cavaliers can handle everything. I need an archer to help me out because maybe they can double more reliably or they can chip from a safe distance. And that brings me to this next point, which we haven't talked about much at all, are enemies and enemy stats. So getting back to like that part at the beginning, context of their game, if the enemies are good, archers are going to be way more valuable. And here's why. When enemies hit hard, you do not want to take damage. If you're getting consistently to it KO'd, you don't want to take half your hit points on player phase trying to kill something or whittle something down. If the enemies are really scary, having the archer be able to attack from a safe distance and do that chip so that you can move up and get that kill with someone else at one range and not take any damage, that's big. That's going to relieve your healers of a lot of trouble. If enemies are weak and you're just going to let them crash against you and just like one round them consistently, like wave after wave after wave, then it doesn't really matter as much. It's like, okay, well, yeah, you can chip this for me, but like I'm going to kill it anyway and not take much for it with my one range weapon, for example. Similarly, difficult for the player to consistently one round. We talked about this a little bit. If everyone's one rounding, then it's like, why use the unit that doesn't have an enemy phase? I can one round an enemy phase too, the archer can't, so see ya. If it's difficult for the player to one round, then having the archer on player phase to help chip and clean things up is going to make a big difference. Enemies also need to have stats and placement to encourage player phase orientation. I'm not going to go too much into this because I could spend a lot of time talking about player phase versus enemy phase, and we've touched upon it quite a bit already. But if the enemies are statted in such a way and they're placed in such a way that the player feels compelled to take action on their turn versus waiting for the enemies to come to them, archers are going to be much more inclined to excel and be useful in that environment. If I know that every turn I need my archer attacking something so that it doesn't attack me first, the archer is going to be very valuable because it's not going to take damage in most cases when attacking, which is going to make things a lot easier for you in the long run. If everything is like, all right, I got to wait it out for the enemy to come through, you're going to have frontline units doing most of the heavy lifting. The archer's kind of just going to be sitting back and maybe like chipping some stuff every once in a while when the opportunity presents itself in a player phase where you haven't one-rounded everything in sight, right? So keep that in mind. You want to encourage the player phase orientation because that's where archers at their best. They're player phase units. And lastly, flyers. If you have good flyers, they're strong, they're tough, but you have a bow user that can do big damage to them and other units struggle to do as well, they're going to really stand out a lot more. If there are plenty of flyers and bow users are the most reliable way, you're going to want to use them. You know, if you're seeing like, okay, here's this army of Pegasi or Wyverns coming at me, I definitely want to make sure I have maybe one or even two bow users to help me clean these guys out so I don't get overwhelmed, because they're going to do much more damage than my other units. So keep that in mind. I feel like a lot of the vanilla games don't really bombard you with too many flyers, and when they do, they're really not that hard to kill. So if you have tough flyers, man, bow users are going to be really valuable. So keep that in mind. The composition of enemies also really important. So that's about everything that I wanted to share here as my summary. Thanks for watching, guys. But in short, with archers, you really want to focus on their strengths. They're offensive units. You have to make your game reward that. If the game rewards kind of waiting and letting the enemies crash against you, archers are never going to be useful, because they can't attack at close range, and they're usually not going to be statted at close range, or for close range combat. Especially if you aren't tweaking the base formula too much. So keep that in mind. Archers are going to excel when it's player phase orientation, when they have good weapons, and when the enemies are conducive to you wanting to use the archer as your best option. If the game doesn't require you to use something niche like a bow, then you're not going to bother deploying it. FE7 doesn't require you to take advantage of your more niche weapons. I remember, even as a kid playing FE7, I like never used the Horse Slayer, the hammer, the long sword. I never used any of that crap. One, because it wasn't very good, but two, I didn't really need it. And when you do need those weapons, you do need those niches, it's usually a sign the enemies are tougher. And bows, I think, are pretty similar. They're an effective weapon type that has some drawbacks. They can attack at close range. If I want to encourage someone to use a bow, I need to make it so that the bows can do something that none of the other units can. So this video applies, you know, I looked at the lens of archers because I think when people talk about bow users, they generally think about archers. But this also applies to like nomads and rangers and bow calves as well. So all things to keep in mind. I hope this video is helpful. It's a little late when I'm recording this. I'm pretty tired, but I had a lot of fun making this. I hope this is just helpful for you as you're considering like that question. How do I make bow users good? So we can go back here to our earlier slide here. I hope you learned these things. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to design your archers, but I hope you got the gist right. Focus on their differentiation, focus on their strengths, make their strengths unique and worthwhile, and you'll be all set. How you do that is really up to you and depends on the kind of context of the game you want. I hope these tips are helpful. I hope that you find them useful when you're designing and thinking about games. And let me know in the comments if there was anything else that you think I missed. There's a lot more I could have talked about. I probably could have gone in more depth in certain things. Let me know if you think that I am stupid for thinking Jammin is a good unit, or at least good across. If I'm thinking about like top archers in Fire Emblem, I would say Jammin is certainly in the upper half of these. That's the hill I'm going to die on for that. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. My name is Pandan, and I'll see you guys next time for some more Fire Emblem discussion. Until then.